they're heroes. Support them, and if you fancy doing it for a job, as long as you follow the C word, which is commitment, and you are committed every day to every task, you'll have a remarkable career that you'll look back on with great, great pride. Do I want to have the capacity for taking another human being's life? Yeah, I think I need to. I went, did my firearms training, threw myself into it. It was brilliant. The load and reload, and you did it again, and you did it again, and you shot and shot and shot and shot and shot. Training saved my life.
Are you in fear for your life?
I've lived in the witness protection program, all right? I've been threatened by professionals. I lived in fear of the assassin's bullet in the back of my head every day. I lived in fear of that explosive device under my car, which is why I checked it every day for 2 years in those miserable, miserable times in the witness protection program. And through a combination of factors, I worried myself to a catastrophic mental health breakdown. I'm gonna go and look for Kevin Parle. Liam Kelly, 16 years old, right? Shot dead in 2004. Lucy Hargreaves, a 22-year-old mother of 3 young children, shot dead on her sofa in her own home. But bit by bit, podcast episode by podcast episode, book by book, I'm shrinking the world for Kevin Parle. And I'm gonna tighten and screw that globe so tightly that eventually his 6'6" head pops up. He will be found.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Peter Bleksley, the former police detective turned author, playwright, and broadcaster. You served in the Metropolitan Police Service for over 2 decades, walking the beat and later specializing in organized crime. You then went undercover, working at Scotland Yard for over 10 years, posing as an international drug trafficker, weapons dealer, and contract killer. Later, you were forced into the witness protection program for 2 years and suffered a mental breakdown. Since leaving the police force, you've written 4 books and starred for 6 seasons in the Channel 4 reality show Hunted, where everyday members of the public become fugitives trying to escape capture. Your latest book, Manhunt, and your hit BBC podcast of the same name details your ongoing pursuit of the double murder and Britain's most wanted fugitive, Kevin Parle. Peter, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much for having me.
Big fan. I'm so glad you're here. We've got a lot to talk about from the book to the series and your whole history. But I thought we'd start off and talk about police because you have such a background there. And, you know, I've spent 20 years in this country. So, and I'm a citizen and I'm gonna be buried in this city. I love it here. I love London. It's part of my DNA. My children were born here. But I also grew up in a different country where they police differently. So when I look at the Metropolitan Police, I see differences. And I still remember when I was 21 years old, I moved to New York City in 1993. And Mayor Giuliani had kind of just got there. And there was a police officer on every corner. And New York scared the hell out of me, to be honest. I mean, I was a kid from San Diego, California. And I felt so good seeing those police officers there. I felt like I could walk around that city. And the NYPD officer has a certain vibe to them. You know, they have a certain look, a certain build, a certain demeanor for that city. And it definitely promoted me feeling good. And In London, it's a different feel. It is now versus when I got here, maybe for when you were on the force. And I was wondering if you could tell me, first of all, what do you think is the state of Metropolitan Police? Is the vibe always going to be different in a city like London because you police a community and it depends on the community? And how has the police service changed over the years? I know it's a lot of questions. But...
Yeah, but let's just go back to New York, 93, if we may, because you had Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, as you've mentioned, and I think the police chief was Bill Bratton at the time.
Sounds familiar.
And they were both disciples of the fixing broken windows philosophy, which essentially said, if you deal with the low-level crime, quite literally the broken windows, or in New York's case at the time, it was the people that stood at traffic lights with a spongy cleaning your windscreen, and then almost in an intimidating kind of way, putting their hand out and wanting a few cents or $1 or whatever. And they clamped down on that first.
Right, zero tolerance, they called it.
Yeah, but it did have a title of fixing broken windows, and there were books written about it, and it kind of became a bit of a thing. Now, it proved to be, at that time, and we're talking about, many decades ago, it was seen as being a rip-roaring success. And there were many people that wanted to import it into the UK, because we also had our spongy people at traffic lights and what have you. You know, what happens in the States, we so often import a few years later. But was it kind of sustainable? It was for New York because they simply had the numbers of officers to be able to do that. Now, to do that policing, as you've said, you need quite literally a police officer on every street corner. And in the UK, whether it be London or Manchester or Glasgow, that quite simply is not going to happen. So if we fast forward to where we're at now, we are on the back of a decade or more of austerity. The government policy to slash and burn public spending in every aspect. And policing suffered more than most, I would suggest. The 20,000 police officer jobs were just butchered in the UK. 30,000 or more back office jobs, so civilian workers that did vital roles behind the scenes, those jobs got lost. And quite simply, you cannot slash those kind of police and police staff numbers and not expect there to be some kind of repercussion. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, who quite simply did not understand modern policing, drove this home. She had the temerity to accuse the police of crying wolf when officers were saying, you keep cutting numbers, there's going to be repercussions. So we've kind of found ourselves in a situation whereby the police are chronically understaffed, underfunded, overworked, and demoralised. The current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, loves a soundbite and said, I'm going to recruit 20,000 police officers, which sounds like a great headline, but it doesn't really cut to the core of the problem, because all those 20,000 officer jobs that were cut took thousands upon thousands of years of policing experience with them. And policing experience cannot be bought. It's vital. It's absolutely crucial. And now, whilst there is a recruitment drive going on to try and build those numbers up, you don't need 20,000. You need 40 or maybe 50,000 actually, because the police are still hemorrhaging officers in frighteningly high numbers because they are overworked, underpaid and demoralised. So consequently, policing in the UK, sadly, still remains largely in crisis.
Okay. And the knife crime numbers that the mayor has been blamed for them going to these shocking levels, I mean, is that a consequence of that, or are there some potential solutions, in your mind as an ex-officer?
It is an absolute tragedy, the tide of teenage bloodshed that flows through our streets. It really is. Lives have been needlessly lost. Now, can you use a blunt instrument to try and fix that? And I've actually been at one point when it was in such a crisis and so many lives were being lost, they still are, that I was thinking, shall we go to the military in terms of that, a uniform presence on every street corner? All right, governments are highly unlikely to do that, to put a uniform military presence on the streets, because it cuts to the very core of undermining policing, if for example, and saying, policing and therefore the Home Office and the government can't cope. But
also, military doesn't necessarily police. Police is about community. Military is more about fighting.
It's more about imposing democracy through the end of a barrel of a gun. Right. And of course that, sticks in the back of my throat and many others. But, we were at crisis point not so long ago, and we are still having catastrophic numbers of people losing their lives. Of course, murders have always happened, sadly, and always will. But in terms of gangs and young people losing their lives, something very much needs to be done. I know the Met are trying, and it's, in essence, again, this is seen as being a bit clumsy sometimes, because they kind of they've started up a violent crime reduction task force, and they will sort of focus on an area where there's been a lot of bloodshed, and that's a short-term fix. But when they go, because there's another area that requires their attention, then what happens? It's a very complex subject. It cuts across poverty, social deprivation, lack of opportunity, exclusion from school, absent or poor parenting. All these things are factors, not in every case, of course, but the major thing, which I think should be addressed, could be addressed, is that so much of this bloodshed is over the illegal drugs industry, because we have a global multi-billion dollar, pound, euro, yen, call it whatever, multi-billion dollar industry, which we leave entirely in the hands of criminals, which quite frankly is ludicrous. Because in an illegal and unregulated world, if somebody rips you off, you can't go to a court of law for your redress and have a judge make a judgment, a rule in favour of one party or the other in a civil dispute. In the illegal drugs industry, when there is a dispute, a fallout, the weapon that is used is violence. Violence is a currency within that industry. We all know that. Thousands upon thousands of lives have been lost. Ever since Richard Nixon in 1971 declared drugs public enemy number one. And a large part of my career, I was fighting that war on drugs, as the press named it after Nixon's speech. And the UK responded with the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. But of course, it is a war that cannot and will not ever be won. And the sooner people wake up, politicians and the public, and realise that we need to regulate that industry. And how will we regulate the manufacturer and the retail of that industry? We legalise, and then we regulate. And of course, some people balk at the very thought of legalising all drugs. And I'm up for legalising the lot, not a piecemeal bit here, cannabis this week and maybe something else in another 5 years. No, legalise and regulate the lot, and rip this industry from the vice-like grip of organised crime, so that the growing of the coca leaves, for example, can be done in South America, but through an intergovernmental agreement, treaty, call it what you will. The transportation of valueless coca leaves in huge transporters will not be attacked by pirates, because it's largely a worthless product until it sails into the UK, lands at Tilbury Docks, for example, and then gets transported to a major manufacturing unit where goes through a process which is as safe and as non-toxic as you can make it. Not entirely, I get that. I'm not rampantly naive over this. We could be here for days, to be perfectly honest with you, talking about this subject. It's a passion of mine. And then, through what I will clumsily call drugstores, we retail all these drugs. We sell all these drugs. And you know what? The streets of the UK are not going to be awash with people off their nut on drugs. The whole industry is about supply and demand. And the demand, quite simply, will not go away. That demand has to be satisfied. But you know what? And I've got teenage kids, right? Who have had to suffer sitting around the dinner table with me and their mother having conversations about drugs since they were 10, 11 years old. Because, there's a half a century of policing experience around our dinner tables, so poor kids. But, and we've talked about it endlessly. And they're not in the slightest bit interested in going near any drugs. But if they were, where would I want them to buy those drugs? In the corner of a gloomy pub car park from some bloke with a hood up and possibly a knife or a 9mm down the back of his trousers, who has an interest in only selling my child more and more and more drugs, probably more addictive drugs, so that his custom becomes a regular thing? Or do I want my teenager who's going to experiment maybe with a joint or a line of cocaine or an ecstasy tablet to go to a licensed retail outlet where they buy those drugs, where we know where they were manufactured, we know what's in them, and they get advice on how to take them? Only this weekend, we've had a tragic loss of young lives in the UK, in a city in the UK. I think the death toll was 4 this afternoon when I last read about it. 4 needless young people died, and the police are saying, don't take drugs in this city. We've clearly got a contaminated batch.
That's from an overdose. Right?
It would be history. That would never happen again, because the drugs would be as pure as they possibly could be.
And I've had this conversation on the show many times over the last few years. I had this conversation with Howard Marks before he died.
Right.
And he talked about this, and we've all seen the example that Portugal is with the decriminalization of drugs, which is different from what you're saying.
Yep.
But there's kind of a few choices. It's the way it is now, which I think most people would agree is a mess. There is the decriminalization, the Portugal model, and then there is your model, the Bleksley model of legalize it all, regulate it all, have it down at the corner stop. And there's arguments for all three. Howard Marks actually said to me, he said, Brian, I have friends of mine that won't take something if it's illegal, if it's strictly illegal, and they'll stay away from these things. And so critics of your plan might say, if my kid goes to Boots and sees heroin on offer, cocaine on offer, they might be more likely to take it if it's in that package. Now, that's what some critics would say. That availability might give more access to people who would normally stay away from those back alleys and those things that are illegal. Now, what do you say to that?
There may be a spike in usage after the drugs are legalised and they're regulated and they're more readily accessible to all. There may be a spike in usage, but because I say we, the state, the government, will raise billions and billions in revenue from the sale of these drugs, what that will enable is that our children from primary school age will be educated about drugs. It won't be a taboo subject which people don't want to go near. My youngest kids were educated at school away from cigarettes. That all happened in school. And my kids, bearing in mind that my wife and I are foolish, filthy, smelly, idiotic smokers, my kids won't go anywhere near cigarettes. It was educated out of them when they were that big and they went to school. Now we will be able to afford to do exactly the same with drugs. Get in those schools, get to those children early, I'm not going to say we'll end up in a drug-free nirvana and in a generation's time we close all the drugstores down, because obviously we won't.
That will never happen.
That would be rampantly naive of me.
Yeah, and I had a gentleman by the name of Dr. Carl Hart who works at Columbia University in America, and he has a great TED Talk that's titled, "Let's Stop Abusing Drug Users." And he implies or states that as humans, we all like to perturb our consciousness, whether it's caffeine or going to the movies or alcohol or cigarettes. But a lot of these legal drugs are drugs, caffeine and nicotine. Most people say that's not a drug, but it is. We like to experiment with our consciousness. That's what we do, and we always will. And so there is no nirvana where people won't use drugs, but we have this current state where you're saying most of the crime is somehow drug related, somehow, whether it's money laundering, all of that. And you're saying that would be cut out if we did this. What do you...
Much of it. Much of it.
Okay.
Now, bearing in mind that you would be taking organised crime's largest revenue stream away from them.
So they wouldn't go quietly.
So they're not going to give it up without a fight. But if you beat organised crime on 3 fronts, you leave them pretty much with nowhere to go. And that is price, purity, and availability. So you just beat them in all those regards. So those drugstores will have to be open 24/7. Those ones I clumsily named drugstores.
Right.
So you beat them on availability, because if you close them at 2 a.m, the drug dealers will come out at 3 a.m.
Right.
So they'd have to be open. But petrol stations are.
But also,
it's really not a problem.
For example, London or the UK couldn't do this independently of the international community, could they? Because that would create a bunch of instabilities if it's legal here and illegal here.
Portugal led the way with their decriminalisation. There wasn't a Europe-wide 29-state kind of agreement there, okay? Someone has to be a pioneer. Someone's got to grasp the nettle and set the example. Canada and its legalisation of cannabis, they struck out for freedom in that regard and did it. And it has its critics, I understand that. But so many of the critics of my standpoint, dare I say it, are Mrs. Miggins, who lives in the Cotswolds, perhaps, in her lovely country cottage, and is far removed from the streets of central London and our other great cities where young people are losing their lives in increasing numbers. And she might read the Daily Mail, for example, and go, legalisation, shock, horror, never. Well, unfortunately, Mrs. Miggins isn't really fully briefed and aware of what's going on. And I would have a message for her, and that would be, I would love to come to your cottage and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and a chat with you about it. And I can guarantee that wheresoever she may be, as a complete stranger that I would be to that town, village, hamlet, whatever it may be, I reckon within half an hour, I could source whatever I wanted in terms of illegal drugs. It's coming to your doorstep, Mrs. Miggins, if it's not already there, courtesy of county lines drug networks being established. Drug dealers are very inventive. They're always looking for new markets and new routes and new methods of smuggling, importation, transportation, and all of that. They're smart. That's what they do. We need to deny them this multi-billion-pound industry.
Okay, what don't you like about decriminalization, even as a method of getting to legalization? What don't you like about the Portugal model? Why can't
it's a halfway house?
Okay,
it's a halfway house. Come on, I think it should be all or nothing.
So how do you grade Portugal? What has worked and what has not worked?
They're pioneers, and in terms of not penalising and criminalising problematic drug users, I applaud them endlessly for that. Again, through the billions that we raise, that we not only use in primary schools for education, but problematic drug users can get the help they need. And in so many cases, the help they want. It's not for us to dictate what help might be appropriate, but I guarantee you, many problematic drug users want help. They don't want to be the prey of their dealers. They don't want to be in the living conditions that they're in. They don't want to shorten their lives. They want help. We could afford to do that. This is about harm reduction and people's health as well as denying the criminals control of that industry.
Okay, but the decriminalization is only half of the problem. That talks really more about the users, but you still have the dealers.
Yeah.
And that's still the same issues pretty much are happening in Portugal, and you're saying solve it all with one fell swoop.
Yeah, because dealers still get prosecuted in Portugal. It's not now legal to deal. You can still get arrested and
Will
prosecuted.
drugs ever
for
be
that.
legalized?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The drug law reform movement in the UK is gathering pace every day. There are some wonderful people out there who make my opinions on it look like something clumsily scribbled on the back of a cigarette packet. Far brighter minds than mine who have really thought it out in considerable depth. And slowly, bit by bit, politicians are coming on board. An SNP, Scottish Nationalist Party MP proposed a bill last week in Parliament, starting to go down this route, small incremental steps. Personally, I'd like to take one giant stride, one giant leap for mankind, perhaps, to go, right, organised crime, your days are over. We've got that industry now. Okay. They're moving into other things anyway. They're going into online crime, and so much cyber crime and all of that. And some people are just determined to live a life of crime, and so they will be forced into something else. It won't all be rosy in the garden, I know. But in terms of the drugs industry, I would like our government, to control it rather than crooks.
Yeah, and I've had the same conversation multiple times with Professor David Nutt of Imperial College, who was the drug czar, and he talks about exactly what you say. You just don't know what the purity is, you don't know the dose, and so that's this big unknown, and that's one of the biggest problems we have out there is not having the right information and people not being educated. I don't know if if he believes in the full legalization, but it's some hybrid in there that he talks about as well.
Yeah. And of course, he got sacked, didn't he, by the government?
Well, he did, because he used a facts-based approach, and he said that ecstasy was more dangerous than ecstasy, because David's very witty, and his point is that riding horses is more dangerous than taking ecstasy. And that's true if you look at the numbers, and yet he also said alcohol and tobacco were the most dangerous drugs, and nobody wants to hear that, because Ms. Wiggins says, that can't be right. Ecstasy's dangerous. I heard about those kids that die in clubs, but I have a drink and that's okay. But if you look at the numbers, that's not true, and that's what David was pushing. And look, we need a fact-based, science-based approach here. The problem with legalizing drugs is it comes with so much emotion, and people have very uncomfortable relationships with their own selves, right? We look at our own wants and needs and addictions, and the truth is Mrs. Wiggins probably had a couple maybe small tastes of drugs in her earlier days, but she doesn't remember those, and maybe now thinks that no one should have them, We are a little hypocritical sometimes, even as humans, I think, when it comes to this subject.
Yeah, well, if Mrs. Miggins is, say, 80 and living in the Cotswolds, then I very much doubt she had a dabble, to be perfectly frank.
Okay, at that age, yeah.
Maybe. The cocaine explosion was in the 80s. Ecstasy came a little bit after that. And prior to that, so drugs were so often the preserve of some in the entertainment industry, or those who could afford it, who lived entitled and privileged lives and had the necessary connections. And I came across all of those kind of people during my time, even to the point that at one point when I was at Scotland Yard on the Central Drug Squad up there, I had an informant get in touch with me and said, I can hand you Princess Margaret's cocaine dealer on a plate, right? And I said, right, that's very interesting. My young 25 enthusiastic mind, right, got completely carried away and rather excited at the thought of crashing through the gates of Buckingham Palace, and nicking Princess Margaret's drug dealer on his way to serve her up, and I had the identity and all of that, and got lots more information from this informant who, tried to convince me that this information was absolutely genuine. And I thought, well, this has got to be worth investigating and exploring to see whether it's truthful or not. And our job was to arrest drug dealers. So I, typed up what I knew, quite literally, old school typewriters, it's that long ago. Typed it all up, did the report, took it into my bosses, said, come on, let's go and nick Princess Margaret's drug dealer. That would be a bit of fun, wouldn't it? Buckingham Palace, kicking doors down and all that. Anyway, gave the report to my bosses at Scotland Yard, and funnily enough, I never heard anything more about that. It all seemed to disappear into a black hole. But
And what did you learn from that experience?
there you go. I was too busy. I was out nicking another dealer the following day, or working undercover, or screeching through the streets of London or the home counties, or wheresoever it may have been. So, right, okay.
All right, so there's some favoritism on the force, you learned. Let me just, a couple more questions about the police. What about leadership of the police? What about how the police feel about themselves, about being respected by the community? I mean, I saw recently Extinction Rebellion, they parked a boat on the corner of Oxford Street and Regent Street and chained themselves to the boat and superglued themselves to the boat. And a Met police officer went there and took a selfie video and danced with them. And they left him there for a week. For me, that doesn't seem like policing to me. And I'm wondering, what does that seem like to you? And do I not get it? And is there leadership in the force to back the officers?
Brian, you've got a great habit of asking one question that has about 15 topics wrapped up in it, right? I'll deal with, let me deal with Extinction. I was there.
Okay.
When that boat was there that afternoon.
Okay.
Because I do a lot of commentary about crime and policing on the radio and the TV and all of that. So, and I was going to speak about it on a news channel that evening. So, of course, I like to think of myself as a broadcast professional. I went there to see with my own eyes what was going on. Well, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up because I was so irritated by Extinction Rebellion, just disrupting people's lives as they were trying to go around there about their business, that I got really irritated. And I thought, and I do still think, that a lot of their campaigning is absolute numbskull, knuckle-dragging idiocy. And it irritates people rather than wins the hearts and minds of people. Of course, and I try to do my level best in terms of the environment. I'll give you an example today. I was very kindly offered transport here today, a car to come here today. Did I? No, I turned it down. I came on public transport with my mask and all of that because I do not want to increase my carbon footprint. Am I perfect in that regard? No, but woe betide anybody who comes to my house and drops a beer bottle top in the garbage bin instead of recycling it. I'm a bit of a recycling kind of fundamentalist and have been for a long, long time. I'm all across the environment. I completely agree, and I absolutely understand that we are heading for an environmental catastrophe which will probably wipe out humankind if we don't do something and do something about it quickly. I get it. I understand their message. I'm actually on side. But I think the way they go around about their campaigning, they're losing friends instead of gaining friends. And so I'm very, very vehemently against much of what they do and have done, including plonking that boat in Oxford Circus. Now, on to policing. This whole thing about policing losing their perception of neutrality started many years ago when cops started dancing at the Notting Hill Carnival. The carnival that's held at the end of August in London. And cops were beginning to dance with revellers there and all that kind of stuff. Criticism started as well. It dates back that long. And we've seen a lot of it, right up until today with cops taking the knee at BLM marches and all that kind of stuff. And, it's a difficult one. I personally think the police should be brave enough and their leaders should be courageous enough to stand up and say, do you know what? We're not going to dance. We're not going to skateboard. We're not going to take the knee. But that doesn't mean to say that privately, beneath this cloth, we agree with your cause. But we are the police. We must adopt a position of neutrality. So consequently, we won't. I saw a police officer, senior police officer from Kent Police a few weeks ago, standing holding the flag of the traveller community. Now, I know that irritated many people. And I would ask the question of that same police officer, would he hold the Palestinian flag if he had a Palestinian community living within Kent, for example? Well, would he? Because we know where it started, but where's it going to end? It should end with courageous police officers standing up and saying, we are a neutral body. Whenever we put on that cap, wear that uniform, stick that high vis on, or even, the full public order gear with the helmet and the shield, our position has to be that of a neutral one. We are neutral. We are against crime. If you commit crime, we will deploy all the resources and tactics that we need. But other than that, we are neutral, which means we serve everyone except lawbreakers. We will serve everyone, no matter their colour, creed, race, religion, gender. Everyone. We'll serve everyone neutrally and equally. But the genie is out the bottle now, because if one goes down on a knee and another doesn't, then somebody's going to say, well, don't you care? Are you racist? It needs courageous senior police leaders to stand up and reclaim the neutral ground, because that's where policing should live.
And that seems so obvious to me when you state it that way. And yet the police chief is not obviously giving that direction and leadership to the force.
Well, we have 43 police chiefs in the UK because we've got 43 different police forces with different uniforms, different leaders, and sometimes different policies from force to force. But they have all their representative bodies, Chief Police Officers Council and all of that. And at the end of the day, so much of what they do is dictated by the Home Office, and the Home Secretary is in charge of that, one of the most senior political positions in the land. Well, is it that difficult to stand up and say, we serve all equally except lawbreakers? And then we deal with them according to the threat or the offence or the situation we find ourselves in. But other than that, no flags, no face painting, no dancing, no skateboarding, no makeup, no taking the knee, nothing. We're neutral.
I agree. Now, some would say that's very old school, but the police has to be neutral by definition. Otherwise, it looks like you have favoritism towards one group or the other, and by definition, that's not policing, correct? Like you said.
I quite agree. And it doesn't mean to say that we are not, in favour of every law-abiding man, woman, child, however you want to identify, we're with you. But we are neutral. And things have got to a point whereby, one dancing cop versus a non-dancing cop can be perceived as on our side, not on our side. One cop on the knee, one standing up, on our side, not on our side. They're probably both on their side. But where's the leadership? Where are the leaders from their ivory towers on high with their vast salaries doing their job, going neutrality? Because I'll tell you what, the men and women in the police service in the UK, including the one on the knee and the one standing up and the one skateboarding and the one who's not, generally speaking, the overwhelming majority of them are wonderful, fabulous, decent people who would be there for you, me, everyone in our hour of need.
Well said. Tell me about these recruits on the force, and especially the new recruits. Are we getting the best of the best? Are we getting people that are ready to do that job, that are physically fit to do that job, that have the presence to do that job? Because I don't always see that. And I'm not saying these people don't have a hard job, and I'm not saying there's very qualified people on that force. I know they are. But as a cross-section, if I take a look at one in London right now and take 50 of them and put them there, I don't know if I would stack them up with an NYPD officer. Not that they have to be the same, but I think you understand what I'm asking you.
Yeah, okay. There's some, I need to let you know, there's some very fit police officers hidden beneath high-vis and like the utility belt they wear these days, which Batman would have been proud of. There's some very fit cops under there. There are, of course, some unfit ones, but there are fitness tests that they have to pass every year. Many people would like them to be more strident than they are, and I kind of get that. But of course, policing needs to reflect society. In my day, late 70s when I joined, you had to be 5'10" or something if you were a man, and you had to be pretty darn fit.
And sharp, and the uniform had to be.
Oh yes.
I mean those
creases down the sleeve, creases in the trousers, regulation haircut, and all that kind of stuff. But times move on. We've moved away from that now. And actually, I think it is very, very difficult for a cop to look pristine now because of the uniforms they wear. They got a stab vest. You try making a stab vest look spick and span as if it belonged on a military parade square. It's virtually impossible. You try wearing a high-vis coat and making that look spick and span. So they kind of have my sympathy in that regard. You can always have your shoes clean, of course,
right.
and I kind of, so.
But
so
the look is
very
important.
Difficult for
the
them.
uniform and the look is important because then you have to get respect of the people on the streets, especially the kids on the streets.
Yes, but I think, the police officers on the street have very little say over the uniform they're given and the equipment they're given. There are, of course, focus groups and the like, which, bounce the ideas around and might canvass their opinion every now and again on which is your preference. But essentially, modern policing uniforms are not overly designed to look, as I say, like they belong on a parade square. Now, back to recruitment and the cops on the front line.
Yeah.
So much experience has been lost, okay, through austerity and through people just bailing out because policing has changed entirely from what it was in my day. And on that note, when I joined, it was essentially good guys, bad guys, cops, robbers. And it was a far simpler job, far simpler job, and a lot more fun, I would venture to suggest. Now, of course, policing has become the one-stop shop for all of society's ills. And it's unrecognisable from what I did. Absolutely unrecognisable. Far more difficult and challenging now than it ever was in my day.
Can you go into detail on this? So when you were there, it was, those are the robbers. We know who they are. They do a specific type of thing, and our job is to stop them from doing that. These days, a police officer might get called for one of 100 different things that all require a different response, psychological response, physical deterrent response, you name it. Now we call the police and expect them to solve all of our problems.
All of society's ills. Mental health, for example. Is that a policing issue? Somebody's having a mental health crisis at home. Is that a policing issue? Unless somebody is in danger, in imminent danger, then I say no. It is a mental health services issue. But what's happened to those services? Again, through a decade or more of austerity, they've been butchered. And those services simply don't exist. So it falls upon the police. And of course, social workers, mental health workers don't provide a 24/7 service. Who does? The good old police again. So they get all of that kind of stuff. In many regards, I'm delighted that things are now the police's job, like domestic violence, which back in my day was barely recognised as a thing, and I dread to think what horrors went on behind closed doors that we simply didn't know about. So that's great. But yeah, literally, everything falls at the police's feet these days.
What else is thrown in there that wasn't there back in your day? I mean, the domestic violence, but you think that's good because at least it's being addressed.
Yeah.
But it does require a completely different skill set. And we're seeing this in the US as well, than, a violent crime. But what else is thrown into the police that they have to solve that they didn't have to back in your day?
Safeguarding, social media,
Right.
crime on the internet. Somebody putting the wrong topping on somebody's pizza, and I'm not being flippant, people have rung 999 for that. Everything. It's the police's bag. They have my utmost sympathy. I think overwhelmingly they do a remarkable job I think a lot of the time it's lions led by donkeys who are desperate to climb that greasy pole.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.